Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn, and thank you, as always, for joining me. Took the week off last week for the Memorial Day weekend. Hope everyone had a nice week. It is already June of 2024, and if you're all like me, you're stunned by the fact they're almost halfway through the year. Couple of things happened of interest last week, one of which is going to be the topic of the day. But one that I want to talk about quickly is El Nini made his initial appearance in a federal court in New York this week. The preliminary matters were all taken care of. He entered a preliminary plea of not guilty. Two things of note. One is a few Mexican newspapers, at least this is where I saw these reports, indicated that El Nini became highly emotional upon seeing some of his family members in the courtroom. As you can expect, some on social media held El Nini up to some ridicule for that show of emotion, as natural as it probably is. The other thing that's interesting is that a couple of sources out of Mexico, at least one of which may have a little bit more credibility than some others, have suggested that El Nini either did not oppose a quick extradition to the United States or actually pushed for, affirmatively sought, a quicker extradition to the United States. If those reports are true, I would think that indicates a likelihood that El Nini is going to seek to cooperate with the government. And then, of course, is the question of what exactly can he share? To what extent have Los Chapitos in particular changed their procedures and things such that any information that Nini has is outdated? Nevertheless, his cooperation could be extremely interesting, so we will continue to monitor that as things go forward. The other big event in Mexico, of course, is the election coming up on June 2nd. I am recording this on June 1st, so before we know anything about the results of the election, by the time you listen to this, you may already know some of the results. But today and then next week, we want to look at the presidential, or I shouldn't say the presidential election. We want to look at the Mexican elections, and we're going to do it in two different ways. So today, we're going to look at the election prospectively. We're going to look at the scope of the election. We're going to look at what's really at stake, what are some of the real issues, and we might look at a couple of things in slightly different ways. Next week, we will look at the results of the election, do a little bit of analysis of how things actually played out, and then we'll also see what the reaction has been in Mexico and in other nations surrounding Mexico, including, of course, the United States. This week, though, we want to talk about the election. And I caught myself earlier because it's really important to note that while it's extremely significant that Mexico will be electing a new president, Mexican presidents, of course, elected for 1 6-year term. So a new president for a 6-year term. But this is also, in terms of the number of offices being contested, this is the largest election in Mexico's history. So in addition to electing a president, Mexico's voters will renew the seats of the 628 seats of the bicameral federal Congress, 8 state governorships, the Mexico City mayorship, as well as more than 20,000 local offices. Okay, so this is a broad election, and in Mexico, as in the United States and lots of other places, we focus a lot on what happens at the higher level. So what's happening with president. But when you have 20,000 local offices up for election, a lot of the mechanics of how things get done on a day-to-day basis that affect people's lives are done at that lower level. That is a huge election with a lot of potential ramifications for Mexico and the Mexican people. Mexico has more than 98 million eligible voters. We'll talk about that in just a second. I noted that you have a 6-year term. The presidential winner will actually take office on October 1. So, about 3-4 months after the election, not that dissimilar to what happens in the United States. Something that's interesting is that in the last election where AMLO was victorious, he won with approximately 52% of the vote. But that 52% represented only about 27 or 28% of registered voters. So Mexico, like the United States, has a rather large degree of abstention of people who simply do not vote. And we've talked, of course, about the different candidates for the presidency. The presumed winner, the leader in most of the polls going in, is Claudia Sheinbaum. She is representing the Moreno Party, which is actually running in a coalition with the Workers' Party and the Green Party. She was the former president of she was the former mayor of Mexico City from 2018 to last year. She is AMLO's protege. She's AMLO's anointed and designated successor. Then we have Xochitl Galvez, who is has been in the Mexican Congress. And then there is, of course, a third-party candidate who's also running, but all the polls suggest that he's far, far behind the other candidates. So it's highly likely, almost assured that Mexico, a nation known, I think, and this is fair to say, right, for more of a patriarchal society, where machismo is thought at as part of the culture, that Mexico will have a woman president sooner than the United States or Canada. That is, Mexico will have the first woman president in North America. And that's pretty astounding. Now, there are some other Central American countries and South American countries that have had women who have been the head of government, but North America, Mexico, United States, Canada never has happened before. So I think that's going to be interesting. All right, let's talk about this. What are the real issues? And in America, I think we talk about cartels and drugs and violence and very little else. Some recent polls, including some polls like very, very recent, right up until the doorstep of the election, have said that while public safety is a central concern, voters are at least as concerned about the economy as they are any other issue. And the economy for them really fits into two areas. One is inflation, which is a problem in Mexico as it is in many other countries in this hemisphere, including the United States. Closely tied to that is just the availability of economic opportunities for the average Mexican. Those are the things that are on the public mind as the election approaches. We're going to talk a little bit more about the two candidates in just a second, but one of the things that also has come up, if you remember, especially going back to maybe February or so, AMLO proposed a series of overhauls of the judiciary and electoral institutions, administrative transfer of the National Guard to the military, suppression of some regulatory offices and bodies. Keep in mind that while Sheinbaum has generally said that she supports that legislative overhaul and will push for it when she is in office, if she is in office, that those events would require constitutional amendments. That requires congressional action. And so, just like in the United States, the agenda of the president can be disrupted or impeded by the Congress itself. And so, while the Moreno party and Sheinbaum may be winning in the, at the presidential level, their agenda and the ability to push forward some of their agenda is heavily dependent on what those coattails are. How far down the line does the Moreno party prevail in congressional elections? So Galvez has some priorities that she's talked about a lot on the campaign trail. She talks about stronger state action against criminal groups. She talks a lot about improving economic freedom, economic mobility. There are a couple of things that are true. One is, as we've talked about in a couple of other episodes, there is no doubt that she is going to, or would be, if she was elected, be reliant on the military that has become so much institutionalized. Remember, we talked about how important of a role and how significant a role the military plays in the day-to-day governance a couple of episodes back. She being Galvez, would like to limit the government's role in society, specifically with respect to economics, to the idea, and this maybe is a conservative viewpoint, that the state and the state government is really there to ensure the rule of law, but that private firms, private capitalism should be the main engine of growth. And Galvez has also suggested a more explicit alignment with the United States. Both candidates are said to be in favor of nearshoring. Several have suggested that AMLO's regulations have been a barrier to some of the nearshoring that people would like to see happen. One of Sheinbaum's policies that she's talked about on the campaign trail is that she favors kind of a broader industrial policy and more regional planning, because what she doesn't want is to have a sole concentration of new investments in the north and center of Mexico, leaving the rest of Mexico in more of an impoverished, less industrial, less hopeful situation. Both candidates support renewable energy. Sheinbaum, you may remember, is an engineer by trade, has a great deal of experience with renewable energy. She proposes a boost in renewable energy, but she wants that boost and growth in renewable energy to be conducted within the framework of state-owned firms. So you have a little bit of a mix there. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which is the successor to NAFTA, is up for review in 2026. As a side note, nobody really knows what review means. Some have suggested that review means, let's check in, see how it's going, and maybe renegotiate points. Others have said that it's a whole-scale renegotiation, and that will be an interesting thing to see 2 years hence. Of course, one of the things that's interesting is, as the first woman elected to lead the country, whether it's Sheinbaum or Galvez, they will face increased scrutiny on how they approach issues such as abortion and violence against women. Those are issues that historically have not risen to a heightened position or state on the political agenda. And it'll be interesting to see how either of these women handles this. One of the things that's interesting when you look at the discussions about the campaign is the concentration on Sheinbaum as a public speaker. And AMLO, of course, is very dynamic. A good orator, thinks on his feet, loves to have these 3-hour press conferences. It used to be like he'd do a press conference 5 days a week. Now I think he does on 7 days a week. He's very charismatic. Sheinbaum is anything but that. And how she will be perceived in light of AMLO and his articulateness and things will be interesting. It also will be interesting to see how she promotes or handles topics such as abortion, such as violence against women, other issues that, as I say, haven't necessarily risen to a focal point in the political agenda in Mexico, given her natural style. A couple of the things we know is that this campaign has been a very bloody campaign, and it's not that different than past presidential elections. By some counts, at least 36 candidates for different posts have been murdered over the past year. There's an unofficial tally of at least 30 from the last presidential election in 2018. I think the violence, for me, we've heard a lot about it, but the violence maybe was crystallized in a really appalling way this last week when the mayoral candidate for Coyuca de Benitez, a town in Guerrero, he was shaking hands with supporters on a basketball court when an assassin came up from behind, pointed the pistol, basically put it on the back of his head and fired. His name was Jose Alfredo Cabrera, the candidate. He was 37 years old. He was running for the opposition alliance, and he died at the scene. The reason that it's crystallized is there was up-close video that was widely disseminated showing the murder, the assassination. That really was very execution style. And I think that maybe, again, for me and maybe for others, put even more of a face on this absolute violence. The question becomes, who is the violence really helping and who is it hurting? We won't know until the election results are in and there's a little bit of digestion of it. If there's a perception that one party was responsible for the violence, or one party, looking at the Moreno party in particular, that failed to do enough to prevent the violence. There's also questions about the degree to which illegal organizations, particularly the cartels, have been involved in that violence. There were a couple of analyses that I think were interesting that seemed to suggest that the cartels tend to influence the elections on a smaller way, but with a big impact, or smaller way than may be readily apparent. We've heard the rumors, the accusations that millions of dollars has flowed from, say, the Sinaloa cartel to AMLO's campaign, to other presidential campaigns in the past. Certainly not suggesting that hasn't happened this time, though I've heard nothing that indicates that anybody knows that. But the idea that there may be influence by the cartels at the upper level is possible, right? On the other hand, if the cartel sends $1 million to Ms. Scheinbaum's campaign, does that really change the campaign at all? Does that really change the results? Does it have an impact on her relationship with the cartels and how her administration would analyze and handle the cartels going forward? I don't think so. What is interesting, though, is the degree to which the cartels may have an impact on the regional and congressional elections. And Damaso Minilis Lopez, when he gave an interview one time, he was talking about the Sinaloa cartel and how they dealt with things in the 2012 election. Okay, so 2 elections ago, but I think the same thing is likely to occur, and we've heard other reports that this quote that I'll read is how the cartels can influence elections outside of just the big elections of the president and the mayor of Mexico City and things. So he went ahead and said at one point, to begin with, all the land that we controlled and the people who worked with us were given the order to vote. And their relatives and neighbors and friends and any friends that they had in other towns or states. From town to town, you get several thousand votes. Like one town has 3,000, another 5,000, and so on. And you get a few million. We would order someone to stand outside a voting booth and hand out 1,000 pesos to each person who would show that they voted for the one we told them to. And, one of the things that we've talked about over and over on this podcast is the fact that though there are the, kind of the brute force mechanics of the cartels, they also are adaptive. They also, operate in, especially with respect to CDS, CJNG, and a few of the others, they operate in tactical ways. They're not dumb. And this is a way in which they can influence a number of elections, but in a more subtle sort of way, and in areas where they control, where they are known by the populace. Okay. One thing I should note is that Scheinbaum has generally seemed to support the hugs, not guns position of AMLO. There's some question to what extent she fully believes that, but I don't think we're ever going to know, exactly what her position is on that until she's in office, if she does win, and in office for a while. One of the other really interesting components of this election is AMLO himself. And I want to look at this from a couple of different ways. First of all, I think every pollster every journalist in Mexico that I've read says if AMLO could run for another term, he would win. His popularity may not be as great as it once was earlier in his administration. Again, maybe because of some of these economic issues, some of the issues with the cartels. But if he ran again, let's assume that he would win. It's important to note that he didn't. And I say that's important for a couple of reasons. I have some friends from Mexico who are very good, very, very smart people. People I respect a lot. Who are not AMLO or Moreno party fans. Okay? They're not supporters. And part of the criticism is because of the socialistic nature of AMLO. And when we're talking about the socialistic nature of the party in Mexico, that's so far different than the calls of socialism in the United States. In Mexico, we're talking maybe more hardcore socialism, state ownership of industries, state ownership of natural resources, highly involved military, etc. And so some people that I highly respect in Mexico, highly informed people, have said that in their minds, AMLO and the Moreno Party itself were no better than Cuba or Venezuela. But here's the difference. The difference is he didn't try to rerun, right? We didn't end up with a situation where 2 years ago, all of a sudden he puts forth a referendum to change the term limits. So now there could be 2 terms or whatever. That didn't happen. And so when we hear about this in the United States, and we hear about, the idea that Mexico is sliding into a dictatorship, that AMLO is a tyrant on the level of Putin or al-Assad, it's important to remember that in practice, Mexico isn't like the authoritarian regimes in neighboring states, such as Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua. It hasn't suffered some of the political meltdown of Peru, and it hasn't descended into utter chaos like Haiti. And the Mexican journalist, and reporter and author Ewan Grill has an article in Unheard that talks about this, and he says, Mexico's isn't becoming a dictatorship. And the subheading of his article is "The nation's bruised democracy will stumble on." And I think it's very important to note that, AMLO has his issues. We could list many of them from our view here. People in Mexico could list their own. But we're having a democratic election. 98 million eligible voters will vote for more than 20,000 offices, will vote for a new president. Now, it's a hand-selected successor, but that in and of itself doesn't disparage the democratic principles. So I think Ewan, who I hope to have on this podcast in a few weeks to talk about this election, I think his analysis that, while the democracy in Mexico may have frailties, it may be bruised and battered, it's still surviving. It's not like Venezuela. It's not like Nicaragua. It's not like Cuba. And that's a good thing. I think that's probably a good thing for the United States, and it's a good thing for the Mexican people. The other question is, and this is one we're not going to know, right? How will AMLO act going forward? A lot of the former presidents of Mexico have taken a back seat and offered very little with respect to a continuing observation on politics. Some of them have gone to different countries. Some of them have come to the United States and been involved in academia or in other things. AMLO's personality is such that you wonder whether or not he can, in fact, sit back and not comment, sit back and not try to direct policy. And the natural corollary to that question is, to what extent will his presence restrain the new president, particularly if it's Sheinbaum? We talked about this a couple weeks ago. There are some who suggest that at her core, Ms. Sheinbaum has, I'll use a lawyer term, not insignificant deviations from AMLO's policies. There are significant areas in which, left to her own devices, she would institute policies different from AMLO. Some of that on the energy front, some of that on the industrial front, which we discussed earlier, and some of that in the relationship with the military and the efforts against the cartels. If AMLO doesn't take a backseat and isn't quiet in that backseat, to what extent will his presence, or maybe better said, his voice, restrain Sheinbaum should she become elected and should she wish to deviate from some of the stated policies and long-term policies of AMLO? That, again, as I say, we won't know unless, of course, she is elected, and even then we won't know for several months or maybe even years, and that will take some analysis and some discussion. Again, just so that people have it, the discussion on AMLO and democracy in Mexico, Ewan Grillo is the one who wrote it. It's an unheard. You should look it up, UNHERD, if you're interested. I think it's a short article, 5-minute read or so, but very well done. And again, not making any promises, but really hope to get Ewan on the show soon. So that, my friends, is a preview of the Mexican election. Results, at least preliminary results, should be announced by the government sometime around 10 p.m. local time on June 2nd. Look forward to seeing those. And we will be back next week with a discussion of those results and if there's anything that we can take from the results going forward. As I noted or the last episode maybe, this is episode 97. Episode 98 will be next week. 99 is not determined yet. And then we will do something special for episode 100 In particular, we're going to go back for 100 and a few after that and talk about some new thoughts and new ways of looking at a few things with respect to the Camarena case. And I'm really excited about that. Hope that some people will be as well. And with that, this has been Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena for this week. We will see you next week with a recap on the Mexican election. Have a great week, everyone.